The interim budget, or the vote on account, is less than 72 hours away. The government has released its review of the economy. Now, this is not the economic survey that's usually released ahead of the budget. Remember, the upcoming budget is only a vote on account, with the election scheduled in summer. So what is the government's review of the economy and its outlook? Well, the 74-page document written by the Chief Economic Advisor, Anantha Nageshwaran, expects GDP growth rate in FY25 to be near 7%. The report expects India to become a $5 trillion economy in 3 years, making it the third largest in the world. It also says that India can aspire to become a $7 trillion economy by 2030. But all of this is contingent on several factors. The report warns of a new geopolitical risk emerging from the Red Sea crisis that could impact global inflation and economic output. It also highlights that supply chain disruption could impact transportation costs and trade flows across the world. Well, joining me now to discuss not just the economic review that's been put out by the government today, but also his expectations on the budget, is the former Chief Economic Advisor's predecessor, KV Subramanian. He's currently the India Executive Director at the International Monetary Fund and our budget editor this year for CNBC-TV18, the budget editor for 2024 for the interim budget. Mr. Subramanian, always a pleasure. Many thanks for joining us here on CNBC-TV18. You know, before I get into the nitty-gritties, the nuts and bolts of the budget numbers, let's talk about the budget quarantine and the process. It's a process that's cloaked in secrecy. Now, all of us are familiar with quarantine, and essentially that means isolation through the pandemic. We've learned to live with that. But explain to us what happens in North Block, in the Finance Ministry, as the budget quarantine sets in.
Yeah, it's a process that indeed does seek a lot of curiosity. So typically, at least that's the way it used to be when I was there, and not very long back. So there'd be a lot of parleys, discussions first in the ministry, chaired by the Honorable Finance Minister, among her and the Secretary and the Chief Economic Advisor. There are also meetings that happen with various stakeholders, including economists, including industry practitioners, etc. At the same time also, and this is a very part that is shrouded in secrecy, after the halwa ceremony is over, those who are preparing the budget go into seclusion. They actually are, for about a week, if I remember it correctly, they eat, sleep, work, everything there, so they can't come out. Yes, even so, as the Secretary or the Chief Economic Advisor, you have police people stationed outside your offices. Even if you have to go to the washroom, you have to sort of, walk through them. So it's a process that actually does inspire a lot of curiosity, possibly because of these things.
Well, absolutely, it does inspire a lot of curiosity. Are you missing all of that? Are you missing being in North Block under supervision and scrutiny?
As I've said before, Shireen, I had my share. I really loved it. I was very privileged to be able to contribute at a time when the economy was going through a very difficult period, and I am absolutely satisfied.
Well, Mr. Subramanian, let's now talk about Budget 2024. Of course, it is going to be in installments. This will be the first installment, which will be essentially the interim budget, the vote on account, and then the full budget post the general election. So let's talk about the expectations from this budget. We've got the CNBC-TV18 budget ballot right next to me. We've been taking this across the country to gauge the mood of the nation, to ask people what they expect the finance minister to do or what they would like the finance minister to do. Mr. Subramanian, let me start by asking you, I've got my budget ballot right here. Your top wish list for Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, what is it that you would like to see in the interim budget?
I would expect more of the same, and that would be a good thing. If I go by my experience with the budget of 2019, which was also a vote on account, There were a couple of important steps. If you would recall, the PM-KISAN scheme was announced. There was some slashing of the income tax rates, personal income tax rates. But beyond that, there wasn't much more, there wasn't a very large dose of populism. There was, continuation of what was being done up until then. In a similar way, I think having had the privilege of knowing both the Honorable Prime Minister and the Honorable Finance Minister, both of them actually will go for balance, and I'm pretty sure they will actually stay conservative. There may be a little bit of, one or two schemes that may be announced, but I think more or less conservatism, and the economy is doing well, so they need to just continue doing what they've been doing.
Yeah, and I think that's the general expectation at this point in time, that it will be a continuation of the measures already announced by the government, perhaps some additional tweaking. As you pointed out, PM-KISAN was announced as part of the 2019 vote on account, the interim budget, and the expectation is maybe the amount from 6,000 could be hiked up to 8,000, 9,000 rupees. We will have to wait. But would you think that that could provide that much-needed rural economy push at this point in time? Would that be a legitimate ask?
I think that would be a reasonable ask, even from the perspective of if you want to keep the real amount that is going to the farmers the same. 6,000 was announced 5 years back. If we take an average inflation of about 5 to 6%, then over a 5-year period, a 30 to 40% increase, which will translate into about 2,500 to 3,000 rupees. So 9,000 rupees in real terms would be similar to the 6,000 rupees 5 years back. So that's a very legitimate ask. I would also be, I think, I'm pretty confident that in the path towards the announced target of fiscal deficit of 4.5% for FY26, I expect some consolidation in the fiscal deficit, because the tax situation is, is looking very good. I was looking at the data over the last 10 years. If you look at the tax buoyancy ratio, it has averaged between about 1.5 to 1.6. That is very good. This year as well, I think the tax buoyancy ratio will be about 1.6. So I expect, therefore, that they will be able to credibly promise consolidation in the fiscal deficit number for the coming year.
Yes, that is the expectation as well, that they would move closer towards that fiscal glide path that has been missed over the last several years due to many factors. But as you point out, that the tax collections are looking strong, and that perhaps provides the government some cushion. But let's talk about growth. And if I were to just pick up what the Chief Economic Advisor, your successor, Anantha Nageshwaran, states in the State of the Economy review that's been put out today, 7% is the expected number, or closer to 7% for FY25. That's much higher than what the IMF's estimate is for FY25. What's your own expectation as far as growth is concerned, given what we see today on the ground?
Shirin, before I answer that question, let me correct. The fiscal deficit number has not been missed. I think you have to, our viewers have to understand correctly that, the world over, everywhere, post-COVID, there was the glide path actually is being followed, because 4.5% is what has been promised for FY26, and in the past years the fiscal deficit that has been budgeted has been achieved, and I expect the same. The 5.9% budget estimate, I think, should be achieved for this year, and between 5.3 to 5.4% might be the expectation for the coming year. So I think it would be incorrect to say that the glide path actually has not been followed. This government has been very diligent in incredibly achieving its fiscal deficit target, so I expect the same to happen. Now let me come to the growth estimate. You would recall, when the Article 4 report was released, and my written statement to my board colleagues at the fund was also released. In the last 2 years, my expectation of growth actually has been higher than the staff's projection at the fund, and that has been in the case. The actual number, for instance, has been 7.3% this year. So I would stick to 7% as the real growth projection for the coming year. I think if we look at the fixed capital formation, gross fixed capital formation, the estimates that have been released by the NSSO shows that it is about 35%, 34.9%. That I think is a good sign, because it's actually starting the virtuous cycle, from investment, and therefore we should expect post the elections some of the uncertainty going down, private investment coming in, and therefore accelerating the virtuous cycle. 7% should be achievable.
7% should be achievable, and that is the expectation that the Chief Economic Advisor has put forward in the State of the Economy review as well. One of the big things that's really been moving the economy, it's been the significant growth driver, is government Capex, and we've seen that at a historic pace in the last few years, and that really has moved the engines. Do you believe that that kind of pace will be replicable or ought to be replicable, or do you believe that now, with some degree of momentum, and in the words of the Chief Economic Advisor, incipient signs of private investment picking up, perhaps the government would like to taper back a little bit?
I don't know what might be the thinking, but my thoughts would be that there is still a large amount of infrastructure to be built, whether it is actually the physical infrastructure or even, ramping up even more the digital infrastructure, especially the physical infrastructure. And as you would recall, in the 2020-21 economic survey, the COVID economic survey, we had clearly articulated that as long as the R minus G differential is negative, the debt sustainability path is not at risk. And here I actually must point out, because there is a lot of confusion and misunderstanding even among commentators, those that come on your on your networks. This number of 3% fiscal deficit, 3% to GDP and 66% debt to GDP, that actually originates from the Maastricht Treaty, which was not an economic document. It was actually fiscal synchronization for a monetary union in Europe. There is no economic logic to that. So as long as the R minus G differential is negative, and I expect that to be in the future, about 7% borrowing costs and in nominal terms, and 11% plus nominal growth. So debt sustainability will not be a problem. Therefore, the government should continue its push on the Capex side, and even though let's say private investment comes in, that's great. That will ramp up the investment in the economy and thereby push the virtuous cycle strongly forward. So that would be my recommendation.
Okay, so continue to push on government Capex, and you believe the government has the fiscal headroom, the fiscal space to be able to do so. Mr. Subramanian, since we are also talking about inclusive growth and inclusive development, and we already alluded to some of the schemes that the government has already rolled out, from that perspective or from that vantage point, what else would you like the government to do? What would you like the government to prioritize, given the mix that we currently see?
So I think, the public digital infrastructure that has been created is phenomenal. This is something that I can share from the vantage point that I occupy at the International Monetary Fund. Everybody now really admires the public digital infrastructure that India has created, because that is the opportunity for us to really create inclusive growth, because we can do very targeted, interventions on our welfare programs, and therefore we should, leverage that significantly to be able to focus on some of the rural areas, some of the small farmers, and make sure that their investment actually goes up, because in agriculture, one of the big problems has been productivity growth has been very slow. There's a very nice study by Pulak Ghosh from IIM Bangalore and a PhD student showing that PM-KISAN has actually had a very salutary effect on investment by farmers. And I think that was, if you would recall, in some of my commentary at that time, I mentioned that because the PM-KISAN takes care of some of the left tail risk, it will bring in investment, and that has happened. So in a similar way, I think some insurance, especially agricultural insurance, increasing those so that tail risks are taken care of, that will bring in more investment and thereby encourage productivity in our farms. And I think agricultural productivity, improving that actually is something which is absolutely critical.
we could perhaps see the Finance Minister unveil something more on those lines. We'll have to wait for the 1st of February to see what happens. But since we are talking about productivity and technology as well, something that you just alluded to, I wanted to get your comments on what we've heard from the CEA today on the advent of artificial intelligence. And he says it leaves us with profound and troubling questions because it poses risks for growth in services, trade and employment, since technology might remove the advantage of cost competitiveness that countries exporting digital services enjoy. And this is something that many policymakers world over are grappling with. How do you believe this could be addressed, if at all, whether it is the vote on account or the full budget?
I think that's an excellent question, Sherin. So, I've been reading a lot on this, and if we look at some of the latest research, for instance, Darren Acemoglu and David Otter at MIT have actually been doing work in this area. And what they opine is that, the assessment of the impact of AI and automation on employment in general is actually either one of fear or excessive pessimism or of complacency. But I think if we look at overall, what they say is that the total impact in terms of job loss per se will be anywhere between 8 to 10%, not more than that. There will be changes in jobs, as in the nature of jobs. For example, and this is something that they talk about as well. When the automobile came, those that used to drive horse-driven carriages, or tongas that we call in Hindi, right? They had to train themselves to become drivers maybe. So the nature of the job changed. Similarly, when ATMs came as well, the teller was not required, but we required other kinds of jobs. So automation is something over the last 2.5 centuries has been happening, and every time when this happens, there is this fear-mongering of actually it really destabilizing society. But I think history proves it, that we need not be as scared. Commentators will say, oh, this time is going to be different because it is artificial intelligence. I think even there, the important thing to remember is that there will be some impact, but the impact will not be as large as some of the fear-mongering seems to suggest.
Speaking of fears, and one of the other challenges that the economy faces, and the CA points this out, is of course the disruptions as far as global supply chains are concerned, more immediately on account of the attacks in the Red Sea, but also this whole move towards re-globalization. And what we have seen is India putting PLI schemes in place and so on and so forth to try and see how it can integrate its way with global supply chains and be a beneficiary of the de-risking that's taking place, in continuation with the measures already announced and in keeping with the geopolitical tensions that we see. What next on that list of reforms?
I think this is again a very good question that you raise. We need to double down on many of the reform measures that were taken during the COVID era. If you would recall, and many of my interviews I've said it, that it's policy that has actually made it difficult for our manufacturing firms to be able to compete with their global peers, because our power costs are much higher, labor costs and labor reform. The bill has been passed, but the subordinate legislation needs to be passed there. Power, there's a lot of investment that is happening. If you look at land, similarly, if you look at capital and also on logistics, there's been significant improvements now, through roads and railways. These all accumulate together to bring down costs. So I think we have to continue this, and we are seeing some good benefits of the PLI scheme coming in. I must mention here, actually, especially those commentators who keep urging India to not invest in manufacturing. I have two comments to make. There's some excellent work by Danny Roderick at Harvard University, who actually talks about how manufacturing is special because it actually creates jobs not only in manufacturing but also in services as well. And that is a very important point to remember. And the fact that if we do push through on many of these reform measures, complete them, see them to completion, then there is no reason why we actually cannot see manufacturing sector growth. And if you look at some of the examples of some of the salient firms that are coming in, I think this is important, that along with these reforms, we also have to attract some of the pioneer firms, because when they come in, their supply network also comes in, and that is something which has to, both of them have to run on parallel tracks. But I'm not convinced that we should give up on manufacturing, because that is critical for us realizing our demographic dividend.
No, I get the point that you're making. Don't give up on manufacturing. It continues to deserve special attention, special focus. So the one or two things, in addition to already what we've done, what is it that you would like the government to do now?
So as I said, the 4 codes that have been, the bill that has been passed in Parliament, the subordinate legislation in coordination with states that need to be passed so that the labour laws actually come into place. Along with that, there are some provisions there which enable states to increase the threshold, for instance, in the equivalent of the Industrial Disputes Act, where the threshold has been increased from 100 to 300 in the new codes. But there is a provision for states to go beyond. Many of the states, actually those that want to attract manufacturing, should increase that threshold. Together, we also, I think, have to ensure that some of the land reforms, even at the state level, are done, and in general, actually reduce the number of permissions that are required, for starting firms in manufacturing, and of course, continue on, especially on judicial, because ease of enforcement of contracts, I think, and this is something I've written about, in previous economic surveys, and if our, honourable judges are listening to this, they really can contribute to the nation, the best manner possible by really, increasing the and reducing the amount of time that is taken, because that will have a very salutary effect on manufacturing sector growth as well, but overall growth too.
Mr. Subramanian, since you are the budget editor, I'm going to ask you to leave our viewers with the key numbers that you're going to be watching out for, the budget fine print that you would be most interested to look at.
So I would say three numbers. First, I would look at the real growth number that is projected, and as I said, I expect it to be 7%. The second number I would look at is the growth in the revenues, and my sense is, as I was telling you, the tax buoyancy has been about 1.6. So I expect the growth in tax revenue, or overall revenues of the government, to be north of 13%. That's the second number I would be watching. The third number which I would be watching actually is the fiscal deficit. Of course, implicit in that is the increase in the overall spending. Fiscal deficit I expect it to be between 5.3 to 5.4%, thereby following the glide path towards 4.5% in FY26.
Okay, so real growth at 7%, revenue growth about 13% higher with the tax buoyancy of 1.6, fiscal deficit between 5.3 to 5.4. Those will be some of the key numbers that our budget editor KV Subramanian will be watching out for as we go through the budget that Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman will present on the 1st of February. Yes, go ahead.
One small correction, actually. If the tax buoyancy is 1.6, the revenue growth will be much higher. I'm just assuming a tax buoyancy of about 1.2 to 1.3 to assume 13% growth. If it is 1.6, we can look at actually, tax growth in excess of 15%.
Okay, with that on the table, KV Subramanian, we look forward to seeing you in our budget studio on the 1st of February. He's going to be there with us through the day, analysing the budget in real time. So do remember to tune into CNBC-TV18 bright and early. We're going to be bringing you the Finance Minister's speech and, of course, expert analysis. KV Subramanian's wish list to Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman going into the CNBC-TV18 budget ballot, which will be delivered to Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. Well, on that note, from all of us here, for now on the Budget Countdown, many thanks for joining us. We'll see you again in just a short while from now. Goodbye.